In the summer of 1944, a report reached German High Command that posed an unsolvable riddle. It contained no information on troop movements or supply lines, but instead, a behavioral puzzle. A deep analysis attempted to understand why common American soldiers, men without elite officer training, continued their assault even after their leaders were killed right before their eyes. A senior German intelligence officer reviewed the findings, perplexed. He scribbled a note in the margin, a simple question that would echo through the German military leadership until the war's end. Why won't they give up? To grasp the weight of this question, one must first comprehend the German army's core belief about its own prowess. For more than 100 years, the Prussian military establishment had honed a command philosophy they viewed as their ultimate weapon. This wasn't the powerful Tiger tank or the vaunted 80mm cannon. Their most guarded secret was an idea. They named it Auftragstaktik, which translates to mission-type tactics. The concept was beautifully straightforward. A senior officer would communicate the desired outcome to his subordinates. Crucially, he would not specify how to accomplish it. That subordinate was then empowered, even required, to use personal judgment, creativity, and initiative to achieve the mission's goal. The philosophy rested on a key principle. A capable soldier doesn't require a detailed script. He needs to internalize his commander's intent and think independently. The origins of this thinking date back to the great Prussian reformers of the early 19th century. Figures like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau were tasked with rebuilding the military after Napoleon shattered it at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt in 1806. They dissected the reasons their rigid, command-heavy forces had crumbled before Napoleon's more fluid and decentralized army. Their solution was to cultivate officers who could think 2 levels above their station. A lieutenant leading a platoon was trained to understand battalion-level objectives. A captain was expected to comprehend the division's wider strategic goals. The doctrine presumed that if the command structure was broken, each leader could rebuild the plan from their position and maintain momentum. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, who guided Prussia to spectacular victories over Austria in 1866, and France in 1871 elevated the concept. His forces moved with a swiftness and coherence that baffled opponents. This was not because they were given more orders, but precisely because they received fewer. His generals understood his strategic intent so deeply they didn't need to ask. For clarification, by the time the Wehrmacht invaded Poland in September 1939, Auftragstaktik was the glittering prize of German military theory. It had been perfected across 5 generations and instilled in every officer, from the lowest lieutenant to the highest general. When Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division surged through France in 1940, moving so rapidly that even German High Command lost his position, that was Auftragstaktik in action. Rommel was operating on pure judgment, executing the commander's intent without pausing to ask permission. When Heinz Guderian's Panzer Corps crossed the Meuse River and dashed toward the coast, trapping the British Expeditionary Force, his own superiors commanded him to halt. He ignored the order. He pushed onward. He was nearly court-martialed for his defiance. But then, he secured victory for the campaign. This was the system functioning perfectly as intended. The readiness to disregard a specific order to achieve the broader mission was not seen as insubordination. It was celebrated as tactical brilliance. And then, something began to go horribly wrong. The first signs of trouble emerged on the Eastern Front. In December 1941, as his armies were freezing outside Moscow and a Soviet winter offensive threatened to shatter Army Group Center, Adolf Hitler issued one of his notorious stand-fast decrees. German forces were ordered to hold their ground at any cost. There would be no retreat, no tactical withdrawal. and no independent command decisions. The very system that had made the Wehrmacht seemingly invincible, a culture of personal initiative and mission-oriented thinking, was now being dismantled from the very top by a leader who trusted no one. After the failed attempt on Hitler's life in July 1944, the paranoia deepened into a brutal purge. Thousands of officers were arrested, jailed, or executed. The survivors learned a new, chilling lesson. In this new Wehrmacht, the most perilous action a soldier could take was to act on his own initiative. The system once designed to reward independent thinking was being secretly reconfigured to punish it. The words remained in the training manuals. The philosophy was still lectured about in classrooms, but the culture that gave it life had been suffocated by something else entirely: fear. And in any military, fear is the absolute killer of initiative. By 1944, the contradiction was astounding. The German army had the world's most advanced doctrine for decentralized command, yet it was fundamentally incapable of practicing it. At Normandy, when the Allied invasion force crashed ashore on June 6th, German units near the coast were forbidden from moving their panzer reserves without Hitler's direct approval. But the Führer was asleep. No one had the courage to wake him. By the time the authorization finally came, the opportunity to crush the beachhead was lost forever. An entire corps of German officers who knew precisely what to do sat idle, waiting for a phone call from a sleeping dictator. The doctrine was just words on a page. The instinct was dead. The machine had been hollowed out from within. Meanwhile, across the hedgerow-scarred landscape of Normandy, a completely different phenomenon was taking shape. The American Army of 1944 lacked a century-long heritage of mission-based tactics. Their field manuals were notoriously thick, detailed, and prescriptive. One German officer famously mocked the size of American invasion orders, comparing them to a department store catalog. American enlisted men were not trained as philosophers of war. So many of them were civilians just a year before landing on those beaches. They were farmers, factory hands, truck drivers, and shopkeepers. They came from a nation that intentionally avoided maintaining a large standing army. They received basic training, were handed a rifle, and then shipped overseas. By every metric the German military used to evaluate combat effectiveness, these men should have panicked and frozen the instant their commanding officer fell. But they didn't. The initial proof that something unexpected was occurring came in the form of a young man from Junction City, Kansas. Staff Sergeant Walter Ehlers had already fought through North Africa and Sicily before he stepped off a landing craft at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. He was just 23, with the sturdy build of a farmhand, and he possessed an innate quality no military academy ever taught. He simply could not stop advancing. On June 9th, his unit advanced 8 miles inland into the dense bocage country near the town of Gaville. The Normandy hedgerows were a nightmare the Allied planners had not fully grasped. These were ancient earthen walls, 4 to 5 feet tall, crowned with thick vegetation, creating a natural labyrinth of defensive positions that German forces had spent years fortifying. Each field was a potential ambush, every path a kill zone. The men of the 18th Infantry Regiment, part of the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, fought for every single yard. When Ehlers' platoon was pinned down by enemy fire, Hitler didn't wait for instructions. The next morning, with his platoon cut off and ordered to pull back, Ehlers didn't just retreat. He stood up in the open, drawing all the enemy fire toward himself, holding that suicidal position alone so the rest of his men could withdraw safely. Private First Class Gino Merli was the son of an Italian immigrant coal miner from Pennsylvania. He was a 20-year-old machine gunner in Company H, 2nd Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment. He was part of the same Big Red One as Ehlers, a division that had been in continuous combat since landing at Omaha. On the night of September 4, 1944, near the Belgian border, a powerful German force counterattacked his unit's position. The American riflemen were pushed back. Merle's assistant gunner was killed at his side. The other 8 men in his section were surrounded and compelled to surrender. Gino Merle was now completely alone. Any logical analysis of his situation led to one single conclusion: the position was lost. The Germans advanced, checked the machine gun nest, and saw what appeared to be 2 dead American soldiers. They moved on. The second they were out of sight, Merle was back up. He began firing in all directions, creating chaos. The Germans returned. They again found what looked like 2 lifeless bodies. They moved on again, and Merle rose once more. He repeated this incredible act throughout the long night. He wasn't following any orders. There were no orders to follow. Every officer and NCO in his chain of command was dead or captured. He was by himself in the darkness, deep behind enemy lines, waging a one-man war. When morning came and American forces launched a new assault, they sent a party forward to accept what they thought was a German surrender. What they discovered instead was Gino Merle, still at his gun, still fighting. Scattered on the field around him were 52 enemy dead. 19 of them lay directly in front of his gun. German intelligence officers who later studied this action couldn't place it within their doctrinal framework. An isolated soldier whose unit was destroyed should have surrendered. The tactical reality was clear. The American had no orders, no support, and no rational hope of success. Yet he fought on anyway. Why? But they were asking the wrong question. The right question was, what kind of culture creates a man who finds it impossible to stop doing something? When that task still needs to be done? The answer wasn't military, it was profoundly cultural. The United States in 1944 was a nation forged by 3 centuries of frontier living, economic self-determination, and democratic rule. American boys were raised in homes where problems were solved by the person who stood in front of them. That farmer whose tractor broke down didn't radio a central dispatcher for instructions. He grabbed his tools and fixed the tractor. A small business owner who lost a key employee didn't await guidance from a government bureau. He hired a replacement and kept his shop open. This culture produced generations of men who saw waiting for permission as a kind of personal failure. It wasn't that Americans were individualistic in a rebellious way. It was that they were raised in a civilization that instinctively assumed the person closest to a problem was also the person most qualified to solve it. Authority was something you earned through competence, not something you waited for before. Taking action. The German military had attempted to manufacture this very quality through doctrine. They wrote manuals, designed training exercises, and built an entire officer corps to cultivate the thinking soldier. For 100 years, it worked with brilliant success because the surrounding culture supported it. Prussian officers were from a class that believed in the philosophy. Then Hitler methodically destroyed that culture while keeping the words. The manual still said initiative, but the reality said, wait for the Führer's approval. The ghost of Auftragstaktik lingered in the Wehrmacht, but its soul had departed. The Americans, however, never tried to manufacture what they already possessed. It had simply arrived with the immigrants who built the nation. Consider what happened. On January 26, 1945, near a French village named Holzwihr, Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was just 19 years old. He grew up in desperate poverty in Hunt County, Texas, one of 12 children in a sharecropper family. His father had deserted them. His mother died when he was a teen. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade to pick cotton for a living. He had falsified his age to enlist, was turned down by the Marines for being too small, and then spent 2 years battling his way across Sicily, Italy, and France. By the time his unit, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, was positioned in a frozen forest, he had already earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 2 Bronze Stars. He had already performed acts that should have gotten him killed many times over. He just kept showing up. On January 25th, German tanks had mercilessly torn Company B apart. Of 120 men, 102 were killed or wounded before they even reached their objective. Every officer in the company was dead, except for one. The next morning, Murphy gathered the handful of survivors in the woods, was reinforced by 2 M10 tank destroyers, and prepared to defend a narrow road that German armor had to use. He knew reinforcements were not coming that day. His orders were simple: hold the line. At 2 p.m., the German attack began. 6 tanks and around 250 infantrymen advanced from Holzwehr. Murphy ordered his men back into the forest. He stayed alone at his forward post on a field telephone, calling in artillery strikes on the approaching Germans. A German shell struck one of the American tank destroyers, setting it on fire. The crew bailed out and ran for the trees. Murphy looked at the burning vehicle. Its .50 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the turret. The vehicle was a ticking time bomb. The ammunition inside could explode at any second. Murphy climbed onto it. For the next hour, he stood on that burning tank destroyer and single-handedly fought an entire German company. The smoke from the fire provided some cover. When a German squad tried to flank him, thinking they were unseen, Murphy swung the heavy gun around and annihilated them. He directed artillery fire with one hand and fired the machine gun with the other. He was wounded in the leg. He kept shooting. By the time he exhausted his ammunition, he had killed or wounded an estimated 50 enemy soldiers. He climbed off the vehicle, limped back to his men, and immediately organized a counterattack to retake their original position. Minutes after he left, the tank destroyer exploded. When asked later why he climbed onto a burning vehicle to fight a whole company by himself, Audie Murphy's response was not philosophical. He didn't quote any doctrine. He just said, "They were killing my friends." The explanation was total. It was complete. Now think about Cecil Bolton on the night of November the 2nd, 1944 in the Netherlands. His story reveals another dimension of this puzzle. Bolton was 36, ancient for an infantryman. He was a platoon leader in Company E, 413th Infantry. He had just crossed the Mark River in darkness when 2 German machine guns pinned his company. Down in a prepared kill zone, artillery, pre-sighted and precise, began to rain down on them. The Germans knew this ground. Bolton tried to use mortars to suppress the guns, but he couldn't see their positions in the dark. A German shell then hit him, grievously wounding both his legs and knocking him out. When he regained consciousness, he was still in the kill zone. Orders couldn't reach him. There was no lieutenant to give him direction. Bolton assessed the situation. His men were being slaughtered. The machine guns were still firing, so he got up. He gathered a 2-man bazooka team and, with both legs mangled, waded chest-deep through a freezing canal toward the first machine gun nest. When a German sniper tried to stop them, Bolton killed him and kept going. When they reached the gun, Bolton personally killed one of the gunners while his men got the others. Then he learned of an 88mm artillery piece further back that was shredding their lines. He took his team back into the icy water, found the gun silhouette, directed a rocket, and destroyed it. On the way back, he was hit again. He could no longer walk. He ordered his men to go back to safety, waving off their protests. Then he crawled back to friendly lines by himself, alone, wounded, across ground still being shelled. He finally collapsed when he reached safety. The German command was getting intelligence on men like these. The reports described actions that defied any tactical logic they understood. Contrast this with the internal reality of the Wehrmacht. By late 1944, after the July bomb plot, German officers were under surveillance. The Gestapo had informants in every unit. An officer showing too much independent thought risked being labeled a defeatist, a crime punishable by death. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the very embodiment of Auftragstaktik, was given a choice: a public show trial or a cyanide pill. He chose the pill. General Heinz Guderian, whose panzers had demolished Allied resistance in France, was now in constant arguments with the Führer over decisions he was no longer allowed to make. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant operational commander in the German army, had been dismissed in March 1944 for recommending a strategic retreat without getting explicit permission. The very men who had made Auftragstaktik a living force were being purged, sidelined, or murdered. What was left was a generation of officers who had learned to survive by doing exactly as they were told. The tragedy of this collapse is amplified by how close the original German ideal came to being truly unstoppable. In the early war years, German units consistently outmaneuvered Allied forces of equal or greater numbers. The primary reason was precisely what the Doctrine promised. German platoon leaders made decisions in minutes that took Allied commanders hours to get authorization for. German company commanders would attack an open flank while their Allied counterparts were still on the radio asking headquarters for permission to scout it. At every level, German officers were acting inside the decision cycle of their opponents. This tactical speed, the ability to make an enemy's plan obsolete before it could be executed, was the engine of Blitzkrieg. It made the victories in Poland and France seem almost magical, and it was built entirely on the willingness of individuals to act without waiting. That exact willingness, as German intelligence was now discovering, was a native characteristic of the American private first class. There is a final point to this story that must be stated clearly. The American soldiers who held on, who attacked without orders, who crawled back on broken legs, were not supermen. Walter Ehlers grew up on a farm. Gino Merle's father was a miner. Audie Murphy picked cotton. Cecil Bolton was an ordinary civilian who only enlisted when his country was attacked. None were professional soldiers. None attended elite academies designed to forge the perfect warrior. What they possessed was more fundamental than any academy could instill. They were raised in a society that never taught them to ask for permission. This wasn't a military philosophy. It was a basic life attitude. The American boy of the 1930s grew up watching his father fix his own car, start his own business, and raise his own barn without asking a committee for approval first. Authority was respected, but it was not the source of one's action. The person facing the problem was expected to be the one to solve it. Waiting for someone else wasn't a sign of humility, it was a sign of failure. German intelligence understood Auftragstaktik because they wrote it, taught it, and built a military culture upon it. What they failed to grasp until they read their own baffled field reports in 1944 was that a doctrine on paper, imposed through training, is not the same as a character trait written into a people by 300 years of self-reliant, problem-solving life. The German system tried to build the thinking soldier from the outside in through doctrine and training, and it worked for as long as the culture supported it. The moment that culture was supplanted by fear, by paranoia, by informants, the doctrine became an empty shell. The words were there, but the soldiers were not. The American Army never had to build this quality. I drafted it. Every Kansas farmhand who charged a hedgerow without an order, every son of a Pennsylvania miner who rose to keep fighting through the night, every Texas sharecropper's boy who climbed onto a burning tank because his friends were dying. They were never taught to do these things because they had never learned to do anything else. The command function the German military spent a century installing was already there, carried inside every man who walked off a transport ship. It was baked into the assumptions of the country that had raised him. The assumption that the problem in front of you is your problem to solve. The assumption that waiting is not a viable option. It was an unspoken, unwritten belief that you own the war, just as you own the land you were born on. That is what the German intelligence officer could not comprehend. The American soldiers did not stop because stopping was not a logical response to their officers being killed. It did not register as a possibility any more than it occurred to Walter Ehlers to leave his men bleeding in a field. The war was still right there. The job was unfinished. If you found this story of resilience and culture as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to the WW2 Record Hub for more in-depth stories from the greatest. Conflict in history. A man standing before an unfinished job does not wait for an order to finish it. He simply finishes it.